I'm Liudmyla, co-founder and CTO of Zenbit company. I last 8 years work with healthcare application, and today I invite Martin, a regulatory affairs and quality assurance expert, who will help shed some light to regulation in medical field. So Martin, thank you so much for joining me today. And maybe before we dive deep into this difficult topic, just few introduction words about yourself and your experience.
Okay, I'm Martin King. I'm a freelance regulatory affairs and quality assurance consultant. I'm a lead auditor. I've been working with medical devices since 1979.
Wow.
My first wearable device was in the 1985, I think it was. So, and in reality today is much easier than when we started out, because we have the regulations, guidances and standards that we have today are very detailed. So they really help tell us what we need to do and how we need to do it. I need to add something. I'm English. Originally, I'm English. I started off in the National Health Service in Great Britain, and I came to Switzerland. I'm now living in Switzerland. I've been in Switzerland for 34 years, nearly 35 years this year. And I have worked the whole value chain. So from the idea from a blank piece of paper to taking something in fundamental research, to taking it into product development, to taking it into production, to production transfer from one country to another, to lobbying the authorities to get your product approved at top government level. So I've worked the whole value chain of medical devices and pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, long history. And actually, you mentioned just now that like now it's much more detailed, about the documents regulation, how should it work, but it still changed. And like, how are you all the time up to date? So does that like quick way to understand, because it still changed, right? So it's
yes.
Like, I don't know.
So one of the right. So when I started out, we didn't really have many regulations and not many standards. And in the 1990s, we had the medical device directive and the in vitro diagnostics device directive. And in 1996, the quality system regulation was published in the USA by the FDA, alongside almost exactly the same time, just a few months in between. The very first version of ISO 13485 was published in 1996. So what happened was we had these regulations and directives come into place. And while the FDA provided a lot of guidance along the way, in Europe, things stood still. We could say there weren't many changes in regulations and guidance. So what we ended up is having a generation of regulatory affairs people who were used to just doing things the way the company had always done them. So when MDR and IVDR came along, this is not just a transition problem of MDR and IVDR. This is a transition problem of all the people working in this field, because they're having to take a different approach. They're having to read and understand a new regulation. So, and you know, these regulations are not always easily worded if you haven't been used to reading regulations all the time. So you have to break them down and take them apart. So why do we need regulations to change? This is actually very easy to answer. We have the industry changes. So we have software as a medical device, for example, and now we have AI. Actually, the first AI devices were approved in the USA in 1995. Wow. So actually, for the FDA, AI is not new. But because AI is now in the public domain with things like ChatGPT and Gemini, now it becomes a theme for the whole industry. And the whole industry wants to use AI in different ways. and it's necessary to regulate it. So that's why regulations change. Regulations have to change and move with the times, and they have to change and move with the technology.
Yeah, makes sense.
Very simple, yeah.
Actually, you mentioned very good topic about AI, because I just last month was in the conference, and from my understanding, there regulation for AI is very not strict but not concrete. Yeah, it's a lot of black points which could be interpreted in different ways.
So I think we have to look at regulations in general. Why are they there? The regulations are not there to restrict us. They are there to give us boundary conditions. They are there to give us rules and lines to follow.
Yeah.
So we have some exceptions in the case of, for instance, software. If you look at IEC 62304, the software for software as a medical device, you will find this standard is almost written like an SOP. It's not a normal standard. It tells you how you should be developing your software and what you should be doing at the different stages, and that you should define risk classification. In the AI Act, we have also a different classification. We also have the classification of AI. So whether it is a high-risk AI, so to speak, or a low-risk AI.
But how you define what is high and what is low risk?
This is defined in the AI Act. So classically, a high-risk device could result, if there was a malfunction or a misuse, could result in a catastrophic condition for the patient, for the user. So it could result in the fatality, for instance, or an injury that can't be recovered from. And in the middle range, we have situations where a risk can cause an injury, but it's recoverable. You would recover from that injury. And the very low risk cases are cases which would cause an inconvenience. You know, you get used to having something and then it's not there anymore, or you can't use it, or it takes you down the wrong route. And we have to understand that with AI at the moment, particularly with medical devices, we have to teach the AI to do a very specific task. Because it's not, oh, I put an AI engine in here and then the device can do anything. AI is being used for a very specific task. It could be used for storing data in a particular way and identifying trends. But we must understand, as human beings, we have a cognitive capability, and AI does not have this cognitive capability. It has, based on the contextual information it receives, it is able to deduce trends and make predictions, almost like an autocomplete word engine in a browser, for instance.
Yeah, okay, makes sense. So there are no specific regulation for AI. It's involved already in the exist one, include already in the exist one.
We have the AI Act, and then there's a guidance. There's a guidance, IEC guidance, 34971. So the risk analysis guidance is the risk analysis is ISO 14971. And now there is an AI risk analysis. It's actually a guidance, it's not a standard, but it's 34971. So almost the same, but just with a 3. And 24971 is actually a guidance to the original risk analysis standard. So, and this is risk evaluation assessment for medical devices. This is how you actually assess and quantify risks for medical devices. And we have to understand that we can, if we're just using a device, then it's fine. But we then have to consider the risks associated from a software point of view, and software may classify risk in a different way. And for instance, we have cybersecurity risks, so we have to consider common vulnerability scoring system. And so the cybersecurity risk, you have to find a way to bring this all together and merge this all together in your risk evaluation and assessment. So risk evaluation assessment considers, one, what is the probability of a hazardous situation occurring? So, and what is the probability of harm resulting from that hazardous situation? So it doesn't, just because of a hazard occurring, it doesn't mean that an injury will occur. So there's two probabilities that one has to match. And in this case, if we consider AI on its own will not cause harm, but it could create a hazardous situation in just the way that cybersecurity can create a hazardous situation. You then have to take that situation and say, well, if this situation occurs, what is the possibility of harm resulting from this situation? And it's the harm that is the risk. The word risk is misused a lot. If you read 14971, it would tell you that risk is the probability of harm occurring to the patient. So if you don't have harm, if you don't have injury, there is no risk. But you have to exclude the possibility of this occurring until you can get down to zero. And in most cases, we talk about risk acceptability, where the acceptability of harm occurring is so small that it's very small compared with the benefit that you're getting from the device or from the system.
Okay, so we could not check AI like separately. It's everything like one ecosystem, and we need to see how different, like, I don't know, like device, application, like AI, security, all this put together to understand like where could be the gap. Okay.
So for instance, I was in a discussion where someone told me that syringes don't have a cybersecurity risk, because there's no electronic parts or software. And then I said, what about the manufacturing? In your manufacturing facility to get your device, which has the device has no electronics, no software, nothing. But if your manufacturing facility has software and AI perhaps, there is a risk in the manufacturing process that could impact your device.
Wow.
And so you have to be and this, we call this as we normally address this risk. You do a process validation, you do a validation of your manufacturing process, and you do a risk assessment or a failure mode assessment. So you say, what if this fails in my manufacturing process? And this tells me if there's a hazard occurring, what's the probability of the hazard occurring? And then you can take that to the next stage and say, well, if that hazard occurs, what is the possibility that harm will result? If that hazard goes undetected and ends up in the product in the market, what is the risk to the patient at the end of the day?
Yeah. I understand. It's like, I think you can see all this picture only through the 20 years of experience, because it's like really, I would never thought about it, like about like check the manufacturing by itself and not like the final device. But it's a really interesting example.
So we can take this much further, and we can say that cybersecurity is just a small piece of information security.
Yeah.
So if I'm developing a device, how do I assure that all my code, that all my design documents are secure? If I'm storing them on the web, if I'm storing them on SharePoint, how can I be sure that all my records are secure? This is information security. And if someone got into my code and made a small change and I didn't know about it, then I have a possible problem.
Yeah, agree, but there are like no perfect system. It's always the risk. Like even if we will do the best secure system, use the latest technology, it's still the risk. So like we just live with it, or like
this
we
is
just
this is the great thing about where we are today. We have a standard for information security. It's called ISO 27001.
Yeah.
And the standard for information security tells you how you should grade items. So information security is not only about securing things. You have to have the right people have to have access to that information. And the information has to be available at the right time. So for instance, a device might be recording data. Does the patient need all the data, or is some of that data that's being recorded information about maintenance of the device for future? If a situation occurs that the manufacturer can go back and read the flash memory and say, oh, I know what happened. I can see the history of this product. Whereas if the information was presented to the patient, they would never understand it. And it is just not appropriate. The patient is interested. The patient is interested in on, off, start, stop, slow down, go faster. All these basic functions. And in reality, what is AI about? AI is about putting a layer underneath that does all the thinking for you. So you don't have to do complex calculations, or you don't have to make complex deductions, that you can maybe get an alarm before you have an event occurring, so you can get a warning in advance. That is what AI is all about. It's about helping us. It's about assisting us. It's a tool to help us and help our devices when they're in the field.
Yeah, this has become more close to what I'm working with, because we all the time think, okay, how much should we store? Do we really need to store it? How long? Like, can we delete it or not? Or like, who can access to it? Like, does it too much access or it's not enough access? Like, this is, I know sometimes it's like no right answer, but according to regulation, it could be handled. Okay, and if you take like from Europe, US, it's clear it's different regulation, but inside the Europe, from country to country, we can like follow ISO and that's all, or we need, for example, or I don't know, or MDR, or we need to also like go deep to some like specific country regulation.
Right.
Because
so this is very interesting that you say the US is easy because it's one thing, and in Europe we have something special. I can tell you something. We have the quality management system regulation will come into force on the 2nd of February 2026. What does that mean? That means that in the USA, the ISO 13485 2016 will be law by reference. Now, in Europe, ISO 13485 2016 as a quality management system regulation is not law. It's a voluntary standard. There is a big difference. So if you want to get your product CE marked, whether it's an IVD or whether it's a medical device, you will need to get an MDR or an IVDR quality management system certification, not an ISO 13485 certification. That is, you will find, if you go through the regulation, you'll find that's in Annex 9. It tells you everything you need to know for your quality management system. Now, to your second question, are there other regulations? And the answer is yes. There are many other regulations. So we have MDR and IVDR, as the overreaching regulation for in vitro diagnostics and medical devices. This is a top level regulation. Another important regulation is the radio RED. The Radio Telecoms Directive is a regulation for radio telecoms. If your device has Bluetooth or Wi-Fi in it, you have to get a telecoms approval for that device. It's not enough to just have MDR or IVDR. And telecoms approvals all over the world are done from country to country. In Europe, we have the RED, which means if you test your product to the RED, you're covered. But as soon as you leave Europe, if you go to the USA, you will need to go to the Federal Communications Organization to get certification for your product. If you go to Brazil, they have their own communications approval. So depending on where you go, you will need different approvals. So it's a lot more complicated with devices with wireless communications in them than it is without. So when you are looking at countries, each country has its own law concerning data protection. So if you're looking at collecting patient data on a device, you need to be looking at the local country laws about the collection of that information and how you handle it and where it is stored and who's allowed to store it and who it belongs to. And it will be different in France to Germany, to Poland probably. Every country has their own regulation. We have the GDPR, which is the general data protection for people, but that doesn't deal with just patient-specific information in each country. And if anybody's doing a clinical trial, you need to look at the clinical trial rules for each country, because your regulatory pathway to get approval for a clinical trial is country-specific. You have to go to there's a top-level EU governance, but at the lower level, at the country level, you need to get approval from the local ethics committee and your local institute. And you have to decide in what country your lead institute is going to be for your clinical study if you're doing it in multiple countries.
Yeah, interesting. But if you have one certification, for example, does how to say, because your process is set up, you already have some set of documentation, yes? Does it easier to get next, or it really depend on, I don't know, on device or in the process?
Right. So I think the easiest way to address this is if your device is CE marked, I can take it to any country and sell it and use it. That's not an issue. The issue arises in, for instance, if my device delivers a drug, then I'm already getting into the some of the local rules about, and it also depends on how the drug was approved, whether it went through the centralized procedure or through the distributed procedure through the single countries. So you have to be aware of that. And you have to also be aware that if you're going to market a product all over Europe, you're going to have instructions for use in each language. You cannot just say, my product is CE marked, and you only have instructions for use in English. It's not going to work, right? So you have to have instructions for use in each language. And you have to be able to deal, so you can have your EU rep if you're a foreign company, for example, but you still going to have your local country specific information and apply with local regulations and standards. In the US, if we talk about rules about devices and what they and the materials they contain, that comes down to individual states. So you need to address what the rules are with the local states concerning the materials of your device and how your device is put together, because you don't want someone using a device at home and then throwing it in the garbage when it's going to pollute the environment, for example. And in Europe, we have the W 3 times E directive, but the label in France have their own thing.
And
so
it's
you
different.
really start to have to look at, so you have to look at the very specific requirements of each country when you're launching a product.
Okay. Yeah, I actually thought that it's easier, but after your answer, I understand that it could be, but it could be even more work or the same work than to get first certification. Okay, and in my practice, a lot of, especially startups, because the compliance process take, I don't know, from 6 to 12 months, based on my experience, it's budget, but there are no profit. So does there any way to get this quicker, to be compliant quicker than longer? So what the company should do? Does there any I don't know, general recommendation, or I don't know, things that should keep in mind to make it quicker, not longer?
But budget your project correctly. Make sure you have sufficient budgeting. One of the most expensive parts of a budget is not device development. Compliance costs roughly double the price of device development.
Okay.
So that's the first thing to consider. Getting your product in the market will cost you even more.
Yeah, I thought marketing is long.
As a rough rule, I say consider 20% of your budget as device development cost, and 80% of your budget as the cost to get your product approved and in the market. Now, how can you save money? Or how can you do things efficiently? One, get a quality management system in place. There are many ways to do that. But my recommendation is write a quality management system that you need for your company. There are companies that will sell you a quality management system.
Yeah.
But you will find as your company grows, you will probably have to either throw it away or change it. Quality management systems are living organisms of a company. They change with the company, just as regulations change with the market. So you have to have a quality management system which is flexible. At a very minimum, you need your quality manual. You need to be able to manage changes, and you need to manage the development process. And you need to manage CAPAs, corrective actions and preventative actions. And you need to manage complaints. We hope we never have any, but you need to manage them anyway.
Okay.
So the first thing is to get your quality management system in place. It can be very simple. You don't have to write complex procedures. You should make it as simple as possible. And then get it approved, because many notified bodies will not look at your product unless you already have a QMS certificate.
Okay.
So one thing you can do is you can go and get a 13485 certificate for your quality management system while you're still developing the product. And then when you're ready to do the submission, it's already approved. So then you can say to the notified body, please review my technical file. And you should tell the notified body 6 months to a year beforehand that you're going to come with a technical file. And then they will review it and approve it, hopefully. And then you can put your product on the market. You will need your quality management system to be audited to MDR or IVDR. So you need a second QMS certificate. But that you can do very close to before you submit the technical file.
Okay.
If you're in the US, it's slightly different. If you're doing very early stage clinical trials, you might not need to have a quality management system in place at the very beginning, but later on you will.
Okay.
And also bear in mind that if you do a clinical trial, a usability study, so human factors engineering study in Europe, so even for a software as a medical device on a phone where you're pressing the interface, you need to do a usability study. That will not be accepted in the US without repeating it in the US. So if you perform that in the US, it actually it will probably be accepted in Europe.
Okay. Okay,
but
good
you
to
should
know.
be aware that the FDA this week issued a lot of guidance on gender-specific studies and how different genders relate to devices in different ways. So, although this is draft guidance, one should be considering to have a diverse number of users. Now, for a usability study, I think if you look in the old FDA guidance, the minimum number was 15. But then you can only have like one failure. So you need to, I really recommend not doing less than 30 users in a usability study, but you may need to make that a little bit larger to cover a diverse grouping. But I haven't looked at the guidance in detail to
I saw a lot of like posts from you in the LinkedIn. So I feel like all the time something changed, and that's why my first question was how you like still on track. There are like really, and they are long, like really long like articles.
So I have a number of links that I check every morning.
So your morning starts from checking the news.
So I have a browser that's very wide. So I go clicking on the tabs, so I look to see if there's any news, right? That's the first thing. Is there any news? And then the second thing I say, well, is this news of real regulatory importance? There's a lot of news like we've approved a device or we've approved that. This is not of regulatory importance. What people need to know about, is there a new regulation? Is there a new guidance? Is there something that affects my product? And as I build that out in the week, I build the regulatory roundup so that at the end of the week, by the following Monday, we have the regulatory roundup ready.
Wow.
So that's the regulatory roundups usually between 30 and 40 pages every week. So that gives you an idea of how many regulatory changes there are in a year. It's about 3,000 a year there are in regulatory and quality changes a year. So, but we have to realize that affects all kinds of devices. So a medical device can be a toothbrush to a very complex MRI machine, right? So these regulations cover all of these different kinds of devices, and that's why there are many of them. But if you're very focused, for instance, if you're only looking at the AI regulations, then we have the predetermined change control from last year. We have the 2 or 3 guidances from this week from the FDA. One is using AI for the development of pharmaceutical products. So one is using AI for clinical trials. So you have to be able to pick this information out and say that's appropriate for me or not. And that's why I created the index, so you can do a keyword search of all the regulatory roundups that I've done last year, and now it continues this year. And then we have the applicable standards and guidance. I think the standard selector is up to, and guidance select is up to 12,000 entries now. So you can do keyword searches and things there to identify standards that are interesting or might be key for your product. And you can actually create a standards list in that tool.
Yeah, this massive information. it's like depend, and they give this time frame.
Okay, so if a new standard comes in, then they give a transition period. Often they give a transition period. So 27001 is a good example. It had a transition, 27001 to 2022 had a 3-year transition period. So it will expire the end of this year. So anybody wanting to be certified to 27001 will need to update their ISMS system to be compliant with 2022 to the 2022 standard. There was a similar transition period with ISO 13485. The MDR transition period, we know the story. It wasn't long enough at the beginning, and so it was extended and then extended again. I think the extensions are finished now. There is a lot of noise about changing things for MDR and IVDR, but in reality, I think we are moving into a new phase where we will see new guidances and perhaps interpretations of rules. And there's a discussion that to find a way to allow notified bodies to have something like a pre-submission meeting in the same way as you have with the FDA, so that notified bodies at the moment are completely prevented from consulting. However, I haven't met a notified body that doesn't help you if you have non-conformancy. They usually give you some hints on what you need to do and what you need to change. But in the same sense of a pre-submission meeting where you have a structured dialogue with the FDA, I see no reason why the same kind of system cannot be introduced in Europe.
Okay, so it's usually enough time. So
we will see changes like that, and there are complaints about the fees. We have to understand that the FDA is a very low-cost approach. You don't have to spend very much money if you're doing a 510K. Whereas if you're doing a de novo or a PMA, then it's going to cost you quite a bit more. With a notified body, you basically pay for the hours. So if you have a complex device, it takes longer to review, so it will cost more. What people don't realize is that to become a notified body, you have to have all the staff and everybody before you're ever approved. And that usually takes a year. So you actually have to employ your whole team as a notified body for a year before you're allowed to operate as a notified body and make money. So it's a very expensive business becoming a notified body. And they're private organizations. They're not a state-funded organization.
Wow, interesting. Are you such person, like who can approve that the process is established right?
I can look at someone's technical documentation and tell them if it's correct and if it's good for submission. At the end of the day, you should always expect questions. You should always expect when you submit a technical file that you will get questions. But we must be aware that 50% of regulatory submissions in Europe and in the USA are incomplete or incorrect. So that is a reason why it takes a long time to get approval, because companies they tried to take shortcuts. They didn't start at the beginning and work through to the end. And it's not an issue of having to create lots of extra documentation. Wherever you go in the world, conformity assessment organizations like the FDA or a notified body are looking for two things and two things only. They are looking to see that your device is safe and that it's effective, that it does what you say it does and nothing else. And it's not enough to say, well, of course my device does what I say it does. You have to provide evidence that it does what it says it does, and you have to provide an argument as to why it does what you say it does. So there are three pieces to every submission. A claim. I claim my device is great for injecting drugs. There is an argument that says why my device is safe, how it works, my design inputs, my design outputs, or how it works. And verification and validation are my evidence that it works. So claim, argument, evidence. Those are the three things every submission has to contain. And you are trying to answer two questions. Is my device safe? And does it do what I say it does?
Okay, so before we start Recon, you mentioned that very often you connect it where there is already some problems, yeah? So when you connect it, this is three stuff which you firstly start to check in, yeah? Am I understand?
Depends. So a company might come to me and say, we have a problem with our risk management. Can you help us? So I will say, yes, let me have a look. And then I will see actually the problem is not with the risk management, it's somewhere else. It's to do with the input information for the risk management. Or they will have got a letter from the notified body or from the FDA, and they need help to address. You have to understand, when a company makes a submission, they really believe everything's correct and they've done their best and it's going to be okay. That, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. That's okay. So when they get a letter back saying, no, your device doesn't do it, you haven't provided us with enough information, then they're trying to understand, companies are trying to understand, well, how do I answer these questions correctly so that I'm not going to have to go through this process too many times? Now, there's a big advantage with the FDA. You can do this many times, but with a notified body, you can only have 3 sets of questions, 3 question rounds. And then you go back to the beginning again, and it's a new submission.
Oh, I think it's quite expensive.
That's a big difference between the FDA and a notified body. You will be doing a technical review, and if you don't answer all your questions in three sessions, then you're going to have to resubmit and start again. So you may spend a lot of money for nothing. But if you're going that way, if you get that far, you probably haven't completed the review. The questions are happening before the review is complete, so you haven't spent all the money. And it could be. So I don't know of any companies that have gone the 3 sets of questions. But
it's good.
You know, it can happen. And with the FDA, always ask for a meeting. You can ask for a meeting if you get a letter. Always ask for the meeting and be very specific about the questions you ask. So don't ask questions, the what if scenario. You have to, the whole purpose of a structured dialogue is to get the answers and confirmation that you require to get approval of your product. And it's not about being educated and trying every what if question you can come up with to get an answer. What will happen is you will end up with restrictions. Almost always, if I provide this, will the organization accept it? And they will say, yes, of course. And so the answer will be yes, and now you have to provide it. And you might have to do clinical work that you didn't plan to do. So you have to be very careful about these questions that you're asking and the structured dialogue that you approach, and don't ask things out of curiosity.
Okay. It's very interesting note. I haven't thought about it. Actually, that's all my questions that I had for today. It didn't go according to my plan, but I still really like it, because now I know that it's better to connect with consultancy before you start, not when you have a lot of troubles, because sometimes you have only 3 attempts to make it done right. It's quite expensive sometimes, and when you do it once, it doesn't mean that second compliance will be easy, because country can have something totally different. So yes, thank you for this very, very detailed answers. Yeah, I think that's all. Thank you for the conversation. I'm sure that was also useful for audience, not only for me, and we'll be in touch.
Great. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time. Thanks. Take care.